that is we're looking at Joshua 4 when they go into the Promised Land. And this is kind of an interesting story. But I thought I would play the hymn as a way of introduction because we sing that at our church. But we've changed it some. We sing it as Sing the Conquering Hero Mounts on High. And it's a song about Christ's resurrection that we usually sing during Easter or shortly after Easter. When Handel wrote this, he wrote it for a oratio that he wrote on the text of Joshua. So it's See the Conquering Hero Comes, and it's about Joshua. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is, you know, a little bit about history and how it all shapes our lives. The other thing that's interesting about this is when Handel wrote this, he wrote 4 oratios. He wrote one on Joshua, he wrote one on Judas Maccabees, he wrote one on Alexander, and he wrote one on, number 4. But he writes 4 of these within about 2 years. And they're all about these generals that conquer or restore the land. And you kind of go, well, why within 2 years does he switch from writing music like the Messiah to doing this? Well, in England, this is around 1700 to about 1740, you've had a series of revolts called the Jacobite revolts, where they're trying to restore King Charles or the Jacobite throne up in Scotland again. There's been a series of rebellious wars that take place, and they've been finally put down. So this becomes then a time of England where you really want to show your loyalty to the crown. It's not a time when you want to write something that's sort of a little bit politically questionable or you rock the boat a little bit. And so he writes these 4 orations that praise these sort of classical or biblical heroes about their victories in military battle. And the king and the authorities would have realized very quickly that even though this particular one is about Joshua, it's really about the King of England and his victory. And so you get these things that become these, basically Handel takes biblical stories and then he uses them to support the state government at that time. Well, over time, people quickly realized that, okay, they were kind of good for their day, but they kind of lose their political punch. What's interesting is this particular movement, See the Conquering Hero Comes, he actually used this in Judas Maccabees, and he used it in the story of Joshua also. So you can tell he's cranking these things out pretty quick, and he's taking parts from one oration and he's using it in another one. But what happens then is the church picks it up, and they change the words from a conquering military general to See the Conquering Hero Comes mounted on high. In other words, it's not a military battle, general having battle, but we pick it up within the church and we say, oh, this is really about Christ's victory on death, and he's the conquering hero who comes. So they just change some of the words. So when we sing it, we'll probably sing it during the Easter season at some time, realize the history of how this has gone back. Now what's really, I think, kind of humorous about this is when he wrote these, the newspapers at the time really thought that this particular movement, See the Conquering Hero Comes, was the worst of the entire oration. For both Joshua and Judas Maccabees, they really thought this was the weakest, the slowest part of the whole, oration that he wrote and produced. But that's the only part of these 2 that we still remember today and sing today. So it's kind of like, okay, so much for art critics in the newspaper. They kind of get these things wrong. The other thing that's interesting about this text is, as I was looking at this, I was going, what does Joshua have to do with Lent? And I was really never able to find like a definitive link where one of the church fathers or somebody said, this is why we teach this passage on Lent. But what's interesting is I was able to go back to 1242. There's a lectionary from 1242 that uses this text in Lent. That's the earliest one I could find. So this text, goes back at least 800 years worth of reading within Lent. The only mistake that we make is instead of being read on the fourth Sunday, it was read on the Monday after fourth Sunday. So obviously we did something here, we lost a day somewhere in the calendar or something, the Y2K disaster that happened with the computers. And so we read it on Sunday now. This text is also interesting in that there's three elements to this text that are very important in the history of Israel, but they're also important to us as far as worship goes. So I'll hit those and I'll kind of give you a heads up. It's the stones, it's circumcision, and it's Passover. And we'll look at how these things all fit together. And then the text on the right over there, this is from a Book of Hours, it's sort of like a lectionary, but a Book of Hours was, instead of a lectionary, which is what you read every day, a Book of Hours this is what you read for early morning prayers, mid-morning, noon, evening, contemplating when you go to bed, and then midnight when you wake up in the middle of the night. And we kind of talked about this. I think Carla brought it out. We always get upset when you wake up in the middle of the night, and you can't get back to sleep. Prior to the invention of electric lights, human beings had two sleeps. You would go to bed when it got dark, and then people usually woke up for about an hour or two in the middle of the night, did stuff, and then went back to sleep again. And so if you wake up in the middle of the night, just realize this is normal. It's how people have done this for millions of years, and it's just the electric light bulb that's creating problems for us today. But a Book of Hours was sort of like a lectionary, and it had the prayers and the readings. It's hooked on the front of the chair, the back of the chair there. Yeah, your walker was hooked on your chair there. Yeah, I was watching you. The walker was going. I was going, okay. It's kind of like watching me mountain bike. Uh-oh, his wheel's hooked on a rock. He's going over. A Book of Hours was what you read at the different prayer times during the day. And usually, because this was something that was done within the monasteries, if you had a particularly wealthy monastery, then you could produce books like this, which are just, this thing's over 500 years old, and look at the color on it still to this day. It's absolutely gorgeous. But this is the page from the reading of Joshua, and on the top you have him meeting with the elders, and then down bottom he's telling everybody to get ready. We need to celebrate the Passover and do circumcision. Now, the taking of the stones out of the river, they take the 12 stones that stand up. This is something that is really interesting throughout Israel and the Middle East, in that there are just these standing stones, they're about this high, that are all over the place. So if you had a family and let's say a particular illness or sickness swept through your family and you really prayed and God restored everybody back to health, this might be something that your family would collectively do. Go out and find like a stone about that big and then go set it up, down by the mailbox or something, because they didn't have the internet yet, You would set these, what is going on? All right. I got to tell my daughter-in-law not to text me when we're at church. She's supposed to be in church. Okay. Pardon me? Yes, yeah, in church texting. Yeah, that's why Don's got that little pulpit thing set up there, so you can't see. She's right over there. So they would set up these standing stones. So this is a very ancient tradition. We know that, for example, Jacob, when he was fleeing his brother, he set one up. Remember, he goes out, he's going over to, fleeing to his uncle Laban, and he has the dream of the angel going up and down out of heaven, and when he wakes up in the morning, he sets up a standing stone. These are the type of things. So this setting up of standing stones is part of worship that takes place. So this is sort of the first element in this passage that talks about worship. Then the second one that comes up here is this, this element of making flint knives and circumcising the people of Israel. Gina, I'm going to strangle you. It's buzzing on my wrist because I have an Apple Watch, and then it keeps popping up on the screen here. And then immediately I forget what I was going to say. Oh yes, the flint knives. Make flint knives. This is kind of interesting for this circumcision. First off, when we think of flint knives, we always kind of think of like, grabbing a piece of obsidian or something like that and then flaking it off, and so you end up with like a stone and like a, scalped edge or something like that, and you go, ugh, who wants to be circumcised like that? And that might be the connection with Lent, this whole idea of, circumcision, and undergoing a little bit of pain for Lent, going along. But we've actually got a lot of different flint knives from that period. Here's one that this particular Jewish person, craftsman, makes, and he patterns it off the ancient model, and this is a flint knife that he makes. This particular one, I think, runs about $2,000 because it's all handcrafted, but you can see that you could make a beautiful knife. The only problem with it is very delicate if you drop it or bang it or something, but they're incredibly sharp, they're incredibly useful. But the other thing that's interesting about this is, why does God tell them to make flint knives? Because the people of Israel knew how to do metalwork. Remember, they made the golden calf in the wilderness? They know how to make bronze tools. They know how to do stuff like this. So why flint knives? I think that why he says flint knives here is it's going back to the ancientness of this tradition. In other words, it's going back to Abram, who received it, that it's not a new practice, but wants to remind them of the age of it. And this is why some of the conservative Jewish communities still use flint knives today when they do circumcision. This is why you have people who still make them, and probably charge so much to it, but we have these flint knives. The other thing that's interesting about this is in the text of Joshua, it says they had to circumcise the men because they weren't doing this during the Exodus. But if you read the first 5 books of Moses, especially Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it sure looks like they were doing circumcision. No, they were under Moses and these guys, they're doing it during the wilderness because they get in trouble at different times for forgetting this or forgetting that, and they're constantly accused. So what's taking place in this text when it says specifically that they hadn't been doing it, and that specifically it says no one was circumcised and everybody had to be circumcised? There's kind of 2 ways to look at this. The liberal critics look at it and say, oh, this is obviously evidence that Joshua was written somewhere around 400 to 500 BC, not around 1000 BC. And so the author of it just doesn't know what was happening back then. And so that's why they write this. The second way is, the way I kind of look at it, is that oftentimes in the biblical text, they overstate things, hyperbole. Everything. It's like when Catherine and I went through marriage counseling, the person going through marriage counseling with us said, never use the words always and never. You never do this. You always forget along those lines. Take those 2 words out of your vocabulary. The biblical authors love those words. Always, never type language. Everyone, nobody type thing. It's always black and white. There's never anything in the middle. And so I think what the author is saying here is they're overstating the case. And probably in reality what's happened is there's a number of children that haven't been circumcised yet, and there's probably a number of men that have never undergone circumcision. And there's probably also, we know that as they've gone along, that there's been a lot of foreigners that are joining into the people of Israel also. In the next story, you're going to have the conquest of Jericho, and we know that Rahab and her family are going to become part of the family of Israel at that point. And so probably these foreigners that are coming in, they haven't been circumcised. So kind of the way I look at it is I think that it's probably an overstatement, and that this text was probably written around 1000 BC when Joshua is taking place, and it's not, kind of 500, 600 years later, and that the author just doesn't know what's happening. I think they know what's happening, but I think they're overstating the case. The other thing that they have here, it says, so Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the son of Israel at Gibeath Haraloth. Now this is kind of interesting. You go, oh, what's going on there? Well, if you have a nice study Bible, especially on your phone, and you open it up, you'll probably see a little superscript or number there. In a text Bible, you can go down to the bottom and you can see what it says. With a Bible that you have on your phone, you just hit the little thing and it opens up. Gibeath means hill, and Haraloth means foreskins. So he circumcises them at the hill of the foreskins. And you just go, what a nasty name for a hill. I mean, who's ever going to want to take their kids sledding there in the future, This is not something that's interesting. And so they do this. You get this whole story that's going on there. And then you get, then we get the story of after they're circumcised, the whole nation was finished. They remained in the place. And then it says, today I have rolled away the reproach of Israel from Egypt from you. And so the name of the place was called Gilgal. And this is another one of these things where you get this little play. The Hebrew verb for roll away is galgal, G-A-G-A-L. And what do they call the name of the place? Gilgal, G-I-L-G-A. So there's a rhyme between the verb roll away and the name of the place. So it becomes a nice way for the people of Israel when they're down there to remember, oh, what's the name of this place? Gilgal. Well, what happened here? This is where God rolled away, Galgal, our reproach. The other thing about this one here, let me see if this got focused in. This is the following page from the book of Hours, and at the very top there you have Joshua circumcising one of the small children. Now, this whole thing with the flint knives and the circumcision that takes place, this is one of these texts also that the early church has a great deal of speculation on. When I was saying this whole thing about the second circumcision and what happened during the Exodus, the early church fathers, going back to 200 AD, they puzzled over, wait a second, Moses was circumcising people. Why is it saying this? And what's very interesting is the early church fathers using this form of allegorical interpretation and rhymes off words, they look at this, and Origen around 300 AD says, well, he made flint knives. Now in the Greek it says stone flint knives. In other words, in the Greek they have to tell you a little bit, they have to use two words to describe what this stone is. So it's stone flint. The Greek word there for stone is Petra, which is Peter. And so Origen says, just like Peter, who was circumcised, but then had to have a circumcision of his heart to believe in Jesus, this is the stone that God used and Joshua used. They were all circumcised in their hearts when they went into the land. And so you see the early church fathers, they kind of looked at this thing and went, wait a second, what is Joshua talking about here? And instead of trying to reconcile it historically like we do today, he reconciles it off of wordplay. Oh, it's a Petra, it's a stone, just like Peter, Petra. Upon this rock I will build my church. And that's a second circumcision, it's a circumcision of the heart, and this is how they went in. And I think this is perhaps how some of the early church, perhaps that lectionary was looking at it as far as how this gets associated with Lent, is that we need to circumcise our hearts, we need to prepare ourselves for the Lord. That's about as close as I can get as a connection with Lent that I've found so far. Of course, tomorrow I'll look at a text and, bing, there it is right there. And the final one before I hit the button here was Passover, celebrating Passover. So before, they've just crossed over the river, and now they're moving into the Promised Land. We have three things of worship: setting up stones to remember what God's done at commemoration. We have the circumcision that takes place, a religious rite within Israel, and then you have the eating of the Passover, the celebration of the Passover. We have three acts of worship that take place right here at the beginning of the story. And what's interesting then, it says, and the manna which God fed them in the wilderness stopped on that day. And now they ate the produce of the land. So there's this huge transformation in how Israel's now going to live. They're not going to be wandering, they're going to have a land. They're not going to be a people dispossessed. They're not going to be a people that have a homeland. And finally, also, they're not going to be a people who eat the manna in the wilderness. They're actually going to have farms and fields and crops and stuff like that, once they take it from the people of Jericho and everybody else. But that's another story. We now come to 2 Corinthians. This is the passage from Paul that we're reading. And this is another one of these really interesting passages and stories. And it leads to a huge doctrine within the church. And I'll take a look here at that in a second. Now, I put verse 16 at the start here because the Catholic Lectionary Series and the Reformed Commentary Lectionary Series includes verse 16. The lectionary we're using doesn't have verse 16, so I just thought I would include it because it helps set the stage. In other words, this is the introductory sentence to the paragraph. And verse 16 says, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh, even though once we regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer." Now, this is one of these that also, we regard Christ according to the flesh once, now we do no longer. And in the 1970s, a number of scholars started speculating, did Paul, when he was in Israel, actually meet Jesus and just know him before he came to faith, know him or see him as a preacher or wandering faith healer or something like this? Did Paul actually see Jesus during that time? And it kind of led to a lot of speculation, but it was one of these things that led to a dead end. It's kind of like lots of thought, lots of books, but then everybody goes, no, this it doesn't get us anywhere. So when it says here, once we regard Christ according to the flesh, this is one of these statements that when we get to heaven, you can go up to Paul and you can say, 2 Corinthians 5:16. What the heck is that about? What did you mean by that? Was it before you converted, you just thought Jesus was a rabbi, a heretical one? Or what, did you actually see him sometime when you were in Israel? What is that whole phrase about? We just don't know what's going on. The key thing, though, is that he doesn't regard Christ that any longer. And the reason for it is the resurrection has completely transformed the way we see Jesus. And this is one of the big tests they can use when you're looking at someone and they're saying, okay, how do they perceive Jesus? So this time of year, you get a lot of these TV series, National Geographic, History Channel, that do these things on the historical Jesus, or what does the Bible really teach about this, or these mini-series on the life of Christ that they produce for television and stuff like this. And one of the big ways to differentiate between those that are done by people of faith and those who are done by people who aren't of faith but might be very, very sympathetic to the faith or very interested in it, is how do they see Christ? Do they interpret Christ's life via the resurrection, or do they interpret Christ's life as prior to the resurrection, and they see the resurrection as kind of an add-on or something additional, or maybe something that was added by the early church, or maybe a myth that was developed by the church? This is a great way to kind of sift what's out there, and then you know where they're coming from. I'm not saying don't watch this stuff, but you need to know where they're coming from. You can go, oh, okay, this person doesn't believe in the resurrection, but let's see what they see about the life of Christ. In that particular case, they're seeing him strictly through a human or a fleshly point of view. If they see the resurrection as the definitive thing that understands the life of Christ, then you know that you probably got a Catholic or a Protestant or somebody like that that's doing this. The other thing that's taking place here is when Paul talks about this, he's talking about how the cross transforms the way we see things. And this brings up a doctrine called cruciformity. So you take the cruciform and you stick an ITY on that. So cruciformity. And what it talks about then is, how do you see Christ? Do you see Christ as the crucified, buried, resurrected, ascended Lord of heaven? Or do you see him as a wandering Galilean rabbi that was out just teaching good things? If you see him as the crucified, buried, resurrected, ascended Lord, then you're seeing him through the cross. You're seeing him through the cruciform. Now this leads to a second thing then, is if now I've put on these cruciform glasses that I see the life of Christ, that means that now I'm going to see the world the same way. In other words, it's not that I just look at Jesus this way and I look at you guys a totally different way. Once I put on this pair of glasses, now I see everything else differently. So Paul says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. And that he is a new creature there, I don't like that translation. It's perfectly fine grammatically, but in the Greek it would read like this. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, new creation. It's this really kind of emphatic, we would call it an appositional phrase. It's this emphatic thing that comes in, this exclamation. And we have to put in, he is a, so that you understand what's going on. We need to supply a subject and a verb there. But really it's there, if anyone's in Christ, new creation, type thing. It's this really emphatic. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself, and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So this is what I was saying. God reconciled us to him. Okay, that's how I see Christ with the cruciform glasses. But then the second side, the flip side of that is, and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. In other words, I see Christ through these glasses, but because I have the ministry of reconciliation, now I see you through these glasses as well. In other words, I just don't look at Christ one way and then the rest of everybody else a different way. I see both the same way. I'm using the same glasses for both. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. See the flip side there. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on the behalf of Christ to be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Now, here's the big thing that's going on here, that we see Christ this way and we see the world this way. That God reconciled the world, now we are reconciling others. That, how's he put it here? That we're ambassadors for Christ, we appeal. How do we look at the world this way? How do we see people this way? Well, there's a number of different ways that we can say this. One is trying to participate and embody the cross in all that we say and do. So Brother Lawrence, a Catholic monk from around 1400, wrote this little sort of collection of letters called Practicing the Presence of God. Very, very short little book. But in it, he was helping the kitchen. He wasn't even the cook. He was the guy who mopped the floor in the kitchen. And he writes about how whenever he is doing his work, he's always trying to embody Christ in all that he does. So that even when he is mopping up the slop on the floor, he's trying to do it in a way that embodies Christ right there while he's doing it. And whenever he meets anyone in the streets, he's always trying to embody the life of Christ right there with that person. So there's this embodiment part of it. Another way that people talk about this is people could, I've read a number of different biographies and stuff where great Christian leaders will talk about when they get up in the morning, the first thing they pray is, Lord, take control of my life, use it for your glory, use my body to do what you want, use my mouth to say what you want, let me talk to who you want me to talk to today. In other words, at the very start of the day, they say, I want to be an ambassador for Christ. I want to embody the world. I want to see the world the way God does. And so they pray something like that at the very beginning. For others, it's acts of service or humility, that I am going to pick up Christ's cross and follow him daily in these acts of service. You see, there's a lot of different ways to say the same thing. And I think one of the ways we can practice this is, as Anglicans, when we come forward for communion, this is a very enacted metaphor where we go up, we kneel in humility, and then we take the body and the blood of Christ. In other words, we're saying, you know, let Christ's body and blood become the nourishment that then inhabits my body so that I actually become the body and blood of Christ also in a certain way. In other words, if I'm eating and drinking this, that's what's constituting who I am. So seeing the act of communion as more than just a figurative gesture, but making it like accepting the promise from God and yielding our lives to him, an act that involves our personal relationship with God and his relationship with others, so that we can actually go out and carry out texts like 2 Corinthians. Let me see. Oh, yeah, this is a good one here. With this start where he says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. After World War II was over, there was a very famous theologian, Karl Barth, who helped shape what we call the confessing church in Germany, the church that resisted Hitler. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about Barth is he got to say and do a lot during this time, but you need to realize he was Swiss. He was over in neutral Switzerland, so he could do things that people like Bonhoeffer in Germany couldn't do, resisting all this. But after it was over, somebody came up and interviewed him, and they said, if you ever met Adolf Hitler, what would you say to him? And Barth's reply was that he would do nothing other than quote Romans 5:8. While we are yet sinners, Christ died for us. In other words, he's taking this ministry of reconciliation that we're ambassadors from Christ, and here the person who he sees as the most evil person on the face of the earth, this is what he would say to him. In other words, he's looking at that guy through these cruciform glasses and saying that you're a sinner, I'm a sinner, and Christ died for both of us. Hans Balthasar, in his book that's entitled, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved, he said that, getting this wrong here. He says that when we look at Barth's reply here, that he would share this gospel message with Hitler, he says, if we deny that Hitler had the right to hear the gospel message, he says, then that's to deny that hope for us also. In other words, if you say, oh, this person is not saved, they can never be saved, they are beyond the reconciliation, that I should never talk to them about that, he says, is to give up the hope that we have for ourselves also. In other words, if we believe that Christ died for us and saved us and gave us this ministry of reconciliation, then we can't draw the line with someone else. We need to see that God died for all the world And we need to be ambassadors to share that reconciliation with everyone else. And as a result, this is why I was talking about these glasses of the cruciform. If we look at Christ one way, we need to look at the world the same way also. And then this brings us then into Luke chapter 15, which I'm going to have to move very, very quickly through. And Don's got a sermon on it too, so I'm covered there. He's got my back. The story of the prodigal sons. This is, I went through this last spring in a story about the parables. And one of the key things to remember about the parables is that the parables don't so much mean something, but they provide you a way to think and look at the world. It's a story that provides a grid to see the world. So this one occurs in 3 acts. You're all familiar with it. Act 1 is about the younger son. He runs off to a foreign land, and when he's there, you have this downward progression. He goes off to a foreign land. He spends all that he has. He gets in need. He hires himself out to somebody else. That person sends him out to the field to feed the pigs, and the pigs are eating better food than he's eating. And it's there that he comes to his senses, and he says, how many of my father's hired men, in other words, I'm a hired man out here, how many of my father's hired men are eating better than this? This is what I'll do. I'll go back to my father and say, Father, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me one of your hired men. And the question here is, how sincere is that repentance? Is it actually a breaking of his heart, or is this guy just hungry and wants some food? Act 2 takes place, and this is about the father. While he's still a long way off, the father sees him. And Don goes through this really well in his sermon. The father sees him off from a long distance, and now we get the acts about the verb. We get the verbs about the father's acts. Get the words in the right order here. While he's a long way up, his father saw him, felt compassion, ran, embraced, and kissed him. And then the son starts off with his confession, but he only gets halfway through the confession. And the father says, bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, the ring on his hand, shoes on his feet, get the fattened calf, kill it, let's eat and celebrate. And then you get this statement, for this son of mine was dead and is alive. He was lost and he's found, and you get celebration. And this is where this ministry of reconciliation comes in here. That this son is found, he's reconciled, he was lost, he's found, he was dead, he's alive now, comes across. Then in Act 3, we get the older son. And this is why these two passages often get tied together, I think. Now the older son is out in the field, and Don was saying you get these parallels. The younger son ran away to a distant land. The older son's out in the fields. Neither of them are at home with the dad. He's out in the fields, he draws near, he hears the music and dance. He has no idea what's going on in the family. And he calls one of the servants and he says, what is this? Now notice, the servant says, your brother has come. Relational terms there. But the father's reaction there is he becomes angry and he refuses to go in. Now remember, 2 Corinthians, that God reconciled to us. We're a new creature. All things are new. That we have this ministry of reconciliation. We are ambassadors for God in treating everyone to be reconciled. Now, is that the stance of the older son? No. Here you have an act of reconciliation that's taking place, and this guy's embodying exactly the opposite action, and he's angry. He refuses to go in. So the father comes out and he treats him. And he says, look, all these years, I've served you, I've never disobeyed you. And the very words that this son uses embody what the younger son has when he's out feeding the pigs. I'm going to go home and I'm going to become a servant to my dad. Okay? He doesn't want to be a son, he wants to be a servant. What's the older son who's at home doing? He's a servant, he's not a son. And so that's his whole attitude here. And at the very end, the father says to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. Now notice these two things, these relational. You are always with me, and everything that is mine is yours. he's supposed to have this relationship with his Father. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he's found. In other words, what the father is trying to do with the older son there is to get him to put these glasses on and say, you know what? You're always with me, and everything that is mine is yours. And then the ministry of reconciliation. This younger brother of yours was dead and he's alive. He was lost and then he's found. And this is the tough challenge of the church, is that a lot of times we can accept the first part there, that God has saved us, but then it gets really hard for us to realize that, oh, just as this love that God has extended to us, we need to extend to others. And it becomes one of the big challenges of Lent. I shall end there because